Once upon a time, Leslie was a member of a small church in the suburbs. Every year toward the end of Advent, the members of this church would create a living nativity. About a week before Christmas, when most people were busy getting ready for the holiday, this congregation would conscript a few members to begin the preparations for a living nativity. On the front lawn of the church, the volunteers would slap together a few boards in the shape of a stable. Costumes would be created out of old sheets and bathrobes so that children from the congregation could be dressed up as Mary and Joseph, shepherds, angels, and wise guys. Then the children would be arranged in a makeshift stable so that people passing by in their cars would be reminded of what took place in Bethlehem on the first Christmas. The church was located at a fairly busy intersection, and year after year, Leslie would marvel at the fact that the living nativity had never caused an accident as drivers strained to see a motley band of children pushing and shoving each other inside what only remotely resembled a stable. The living nativity was the brainchild of Didi, the dreaded church organist. Dede was a rather severe woman who always wanted everything to be done just so. Dede worked hard to plan various grand events that she felt would benefit the congregation, but somehow Dede's grand plans were always beyond the capabilities of the volunteers she usually managed to conscript. Over the years, people in the congregation learned to hide whenever they saw Dede coming toward them with her clipboard. If Dede managed to corner you and your name was put onto her clipboard, you were sunk. Once your name was on her list, you were one of Dede's volunteers. Dede's conscripts never really knew what it was they had volunteered for until they arrived for the first rehearsal. By then it was too late because Dede had never been known to let a volunteer slip through her hands. Dede, the dreaded church organist, was a hard taskmaster. There was only one thing that Dede disliked more than uncooperative volunteers, and that was children. Dede was convinced that children went out of their way to mess up her grand plans. But Dede had to tolerate children in her living nativity because, try as she might, even the dreaded Dede couldn't convince any of the adults in the congregation to dress up like angels, shepherds, and wise folk and stand outside in the cold in a dilapidated stable. Adults were only too pleased to offer up their children as sacrifices to the dreaded Dede in order to avoid the cold stable themselves. Although Leslie was a member of this congregation, she didn't live in the suburbs. She lived on a small farm. The farm where Leslie lived was not anything like the farms most of you may be imagining. Leslie and her friends on the farm, they were city people playing at farming. They had a few sheep, a few cows, some chickens and horses. They weren't real farmers. They were what real farmers derided as mere hobby farmers. Every year, when Dede would approach Leslie with her clipboard, Leslie was always more than a little relieved that the dreaded Dede didn't want her to dress up and stand in the stable. Because you see, Leslie didn't have any children that she could offer up as sacrifices in her place. Fortunately, all that Dede required of Leslie were a few bales of hay from her farm. Dede thought that hay bales added a touch of reality to the stable, even though Leslie was never quite sure that they actually baled any hay in the Middle East in the first century. Every year, Leslie would deliver the hay and place the bales exactly where Dede wanted them. One year, the children got together and they decided that they wanted to add a little something to Dede's living nativity. So the children asked Leslie if she would bring a few of her animals to liven things up in the stable. Leslie wasn't too crazy about this idea because she knew how important it was to Dede that everyone stood perfectly still without talking, and none of her animals were any good at playing statues. But the children begged Leslie, and if the truth be told, she'd always felt sorry for the kids who had fallen victim to Didi's grand plans. So when the children begged her to bring some of her animals, even though she knew that it was a bad idea, she couldn't bring herself to say no. Knowing that Dede had very high standards, Leslie decided to take Martha, the tamest of her sheep, and Sally, her donkey. Martha was an unusual sheep. When Leslie was out in the fields, Martha was always right there by her side. So Leslie thought that she might have half a chance of keeping Martha quiet in the stable. Sally, that was another story altogether. Sally wasn't the type of donkey to be standing still, but she was the only donkey on the farm. So Leslie loaded Sally and Martha and several bales of hay into her truck and headed off to the suburbs. When Leslie got to the church, the children were all busy getting into their elaborate costumes under the direction of the dreaded Didi. But Didi didn't look very happy. You see, every year it was the same story. Didi would spend hours working on the costumes. She would lay everything out carefully, and every year when the children arrived, there was chaos. Didi was just beginning to lose her temper when Leslie arrived. Leslie unloaded the hay bales, and as the children were taking their places in the stable, she went back to the truck to unload Sally and Martha. As she led the animals to the stable, a little boy, dressed up like a king, ran up to Leslie, who couldn't believe her eyes. Dressed in royal regalia was none other than Jeremy. Jeremy was the absolute worst child in the world. Jeremy, or the Germ, as he was not so affectionately known by all those who came into contact with him, the Germ was always getting into trouble. The Germ took one look at the donkey, and he decided that as he was all dressed up like a wise guy, he should be riding Sally into the stable. Leslie explained that the donkey belonged to Mary, and wise guys ride camels. She warned the Germ that as she didn't have a camel in the truck, he better just back off. But the Germ decided that if he couldn't ride into the stable, then a sheep made a better gift than some silly old frankincense. One thing Leslie had learned over the years was that it was better not to cross the Germ, because once he had his mind set on something, nothing could shake him loose. Besides, Didi was about to lose control of the entire group. So Leslie handed Martha's lead rope to Jeremy and held on to the donkey herself. Didi did her best to get her motley crew settled into the stable, and then she aimed all sorts of floodlights on them. And lo, there appeared a living nativity. Leslie was sure that this was the year that the stable scene would cause an accident out on the road, as drivers became fixated upon bathrobed shepherds waving their crooks at paper-crowned wise guys, as angels with cockeyed halos jostled with adolescent Mary for a look at the Cabbage Patch Jesus, leaving an out-of-place Joseph to scratch his head and wonder. Leslie tried to keep herself hidden behind a few bales of hay. Sally, the donkey, was thrilled by the attention that the angels were giving her, and she just stood there happily munching on all the hay the angels offered up to her. Martha, however, was not very happy at all. This once docile sheep was going wild. She just couldn't keep still. No matter how hard he tried, the Germ just couldn't keep Martha quiet. The more fuss that Martha made, the more the various shepherds, angels, and wise guys jostled one another around in the stable. All of this activity was too much for Dede, who kept shushing everyone. But the more Dede shushed, the more the various shepherds, angels, and wise guys jostled each other, and the wilder Martha became. When several of the shepherds began to use their homemade shepherd's crooks to keep the angels and wise guys in line, Leslie worried that Dede was going to lose her clipboard. Sure enough, by the time that Mary and Joseph got into the act, Dede had had enough. She ordered Leslie to get that sheep out of there. Leslie was convinced that Jeremy the germ was the problem. After all, Martha was the tamest, most docile of sheep. The germ must have been getting to her somehow. Thinking that she could kill two birds with one stone, she told the germ to take Martha back to the truck and stay with her. Peace was restored to the stable. The children stood quietly as Sally munched away on the hay. Apart from the odd jostle from the shepherds or a giggle from an angel, all was well in the stable. Dede didn't even seem to mind that they were one wise guy short. But then the dreaded Dede and Jeremy the germ, they had a long history of abruptly parting company. So there they were, standing in the cold, reminding all the passers-by of what had happened in a stable in Bethlehem on the very first Christmas. When suddenly the germ appeared, he was in such a state that his crown had slipped down over his eyes. The germ shouted for Leslie to come quickly. Something was terribly wrong with Martha. Leslie handed Sally's lead rope to the nearest angel and quickly followed the germ back to her truck. There she found Martha in a terrible state of distress. It seems that Leslie had miscalculated some dates and Martha was about to give birth. Leslie told Jeremy what was happening, and he tossed off his crown and he began to make a bed of hay for Martha. Then he got out of his royal robes and he rolled up his sleeves. And the two of them set about helping Martha deliver the most beautiful little lamb. As Leslie was showing Jeremy how to rub down the newborn lamb, she looked up and she saw that angels and shepherds surrounded them. Mary and Joseph, along with some wise guys, had joined them. Even the dreaded Didi was there. She was holding on to Sally's lead rope, and Didi was doing something that very few people had ever seen Didi do before. The dreaded Didi was smiling. Jeremy finished rubbing down the newborn lamb and looked around at Mary and Joseph, the shepherds, the angels, and his fellow wise guys. And when the germ saw Didi smiling, he looked up at me, he smiled his own toothless grin, and the germ said, "Unto us a lamb is born." The germ was so right, for on that cold December night, they all met the love which is always being born in our midst. Love comes to us in the most unlikely of places, so be prepared to greet love so that you too can celebrate love's presence wherever and whenever love comes. Inevitably, whenever I tell this story, there's someone, a lot like the germ, who asks, "Did this really happen?" To which I usually respond with words which I learned from the teachings of New Testament scholar Marcus Borg. I don't know if it actually happened this way, but I do know that this is absolutely true. For unto us a child is born. A child is born not just 2,000 odd years ago, but also every year, and most especially in this very challenging year. For in every child who comes to us, we meet a child who is the Christ child. May the Holy One who is love continue to live and move in, with, through, and beyond you and yours during these challenging times. Shalom, dear ones. Shalom. I hope you are enjoying these love stories for Advent and Christmas, which are made possible by the support and encouragement of the progressive community of Holy Cross Lutheran Church. Holy Cross is a small congregation which is progressive in approach and Christ-like in action. The current COVID lockdown has brought with it all sorts of unprecedented challenges. I am very proud to tell you that the people of Holy Cross have risen to those challenges and then some. If you have benefited from their progressive approach to Christianity and would like to ensure that we can bring you more resources in the coming months, please consider making a donation to Holy Cross. You will find a donation page on our website where you will find several ways to make contributions to Holy Cross. May the Holy One, who is love, continue to live and move in, with, through, and beyond you and yours during these challenging times. Shalom, dear ones. Shalom.